In this interview, Will Kleidon, the founder of Ojai Energetics, talks about water-soluble CBD and why it has a higher bioavailability, how to make scalable energy systems out of hemp waste, and why his company, Ojai Energetics, is a catalyst to transition humanity. We also go deep into cannabinoids and biohacking. So enjoy this interview with Will Kleidon. Hi Will, welcome to the interview. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you for having me.
So we start a bit about your big vision and the more spiritual stuff first, and then get into the more tangible, cool things about your company, about your CBD, your cannabis later on. What is your why? What is your life purpose?
It's a great question. You know, I have really been quite lucky to have kind of tangibly aligned with something that I've always felt since an early age, but a deep connection with nature, and then on top of that, with people and life. And ultimately, I believe that we are able to become, and already are in certain regards, a symbiotic species with the ecology that we're part of. And by that, meaning that our presence and impact and how we integrate with other biomes and life forms is regenerative and sustainable through positive feedback loops, as opposed to more parasitic and taking, which is not, regenerative or sustainable. And so my vision is to be able to be part of that catalyst and team of life forms. I liken it to kind of the metaphor of like the imaginal cells in a chrysalis, where a caterpillar starts out as a parasitic life form in the ecology that it's in. It's consuming more than the ecology can sustain. And right before it actually sometimes can collapse the keystone species, which is like the species that holds together that biome. It goes into the chrysalis, breaks down into a liquid form, but it maintains the old immune system, or the metaphor, paradigm or operating system, right? But then these new cells emerge called imaginal cells, and they're carrying the genetic code of the future self. And initially, the old immune system sees it as a threat, and they try and kill it off, and they do, but they're persistent. And then thankfully, we don't need 100% to get a critical mass. In nature, it's closer to 14%, right? Thank goodness. That critical mass tips, right? And then at that point, you have this exponential recoding, and the old immune system actually sees these imaginal cells of future versions of itself. And so it actually protects them and enables it to rapidly recode. At that point, it's kind of an exponential recoding point, at which point there's still rogue pockets of resistance, but it's done. And then it recodes. It's got to fight against the chrysalis to grow its wing strength, right? But then it busts out as this new butterfly that's a symbiotic life form that actually pollinates and creates multiple ecosystems. And so it goes from a mass kind of parasitic form, mass consumption of energy, which was actually required for it to then blossom out into this ecological building mechanism. And that's how I see us. I think we're functions of nature, and it's similar to like mycorrhizal fungus. Starts out parasitic and then taps it into a symbiotic web. So that the big goal is to facilitate this transition into a much more symbiotic function that supports life on the planet.
What is your vision for the year 2050?
Yeah, so I think we're going to be on a completely different epoch and operating system at this point. Energy storage systems and energy communications is going to be much more frictionless, I believe. And when we can take care of the Maslow's needs at a fundamental kind of open sourced and effective, abundant level, then we're going to be creating art, right? Time is no longer about survival. It's about enhancing the experience, and we can explore space, both inner and outer. And that's where I see us going.
So how are you going to make that vision happen, and what are you doing for us to become a symbiotic species?
Yeah. So So I founded Ojai Energetics in 2014. I studied permaculture and regenerative systems design before that. I'm a systems thinker. I see patterns and how things interface that aren't necessarily obvious on the front end. Ojai is ultimately a technology company. So I partnered up with the leading biotech and intellectual property IP firm globally, Wilson Sonsini, back in 2014. And we were the only cannabis related client they had worked with, gave us essentially 5 years of exclusivity, and just started building an IP portfolio pertaining to delivery systems of cannabinoids, which is what our consumer brand focuses on, as we figured out how to solubilize these compounds without using synthetics, which is really important, particularly for safety reasons. And that enables us to get an incredibly effective dosage with a lower amount of cannabinoids that most people are chronically underdosing their CBD content because historically people got their cannabinoids predominantly through eating the animals and the animal products fed the hemp plant. Actually, in Switzerland, you had the Swiss farmers. They were in an uproar when someone tried to ban it because they're like, we've always done this. It's great for the cows.
Yeah.
And in fact, it's not isolated. It was ubiquitous across the planet. Literally every culture grew cannabis as a primary crop, minus the Inuit and then potentially the Aboriginal Australians. But every other population had this constant exposure. It was one of the.
So we would get the cannabinoids out of the meat we would eat because the animals were fed with hemp in the earlier times.
What do you do when you grow a vegetable? You feed it to your farm animals, right? And that's the basis of agriculture. And what's fascinating is that so the plant produces CBDA and THCA and the other cannabinoids in the acid forms, right? You have to decarboxylate them or heat them. We actually figured out how to decarboxylate without heat, and that's a different patent. But when you'd eat the milk, for example, you would get the raw form, the CBD acid form, which has a different agonistic response on the cannabinoid receptors than when you cook the animal or the eggs, for example, you would decarboxylate it. So we had this ratio of higher amounts of decarboxylated, high CBD, low THC, in a full spectrum of cannabinoids with bioflavonoids and terpenes and all these other cannabinoids, right? And then a smaller amount, but a steady amount of the raw form for millennia, right? And so there's one, the Scythians brought it to the Romans brought it anywhere that they colonized, they brought it to the British brought it everywhere. The first cannabis laws in the US were actually requiring you to grow hemp. If you didn't, you would be fined. So we've gone down into a narrow, but that essentially, when we pulled this through prohibition, we artificially cut these micronutrients that we co-evolved consuming that are fuel for the body's endocannabinoid system. And the body's endocannabinoid system is the system that regulates homeostatic balance for the entire body. And so it's arguably the most important system, right? It's the conductor of the symphony. So we pulled these fuel nutrients out, right? And then coupled that with oxidative stress that's more constant than ever before. We 1-2 punched ourselves and got ourselves in this negative feedback loop of endocannabinoid deficiency. And so the study prelim showed that hemp-fed chickens have up to 250 milligrams of CBD per egg. Wow. We're talking about a substantial quantity of cannabinoids, right, that were historically consumed.
That would be a biohacking egg, like.
Yes.
You eat an egg before you want to sleep.
Well, and it's funnily enough so there's certain populations where there wasn't an interrupted intake, which would be Nepal. And so cannabis grows wild there. And I had this Lyft driver and I said, so does cannabis grow everywhere? He goes, yeah, it's everywhere. And I said, do you like to eat the yaks and the yak milk? And he goes, yeah, it's our favorite. I was like, so what do the yaks like to eat? And he goes, oh, they love the cannabis plants. And so it goes to the bulletproof, right? Dave's story of having that yak butter and that enhanced flow, essentially. There would have been cannabinoids in that yak butter, which is pretty cool.
But do they get it from the yaks in Nepal?
Yak butter. Oh, they eat the yaks and they consume the milk and make butter, so that will have cannabinoids in it. It's fascinating, but. So on that front, with our bioavailability, we're able to enhancement with the encapsulation, we can get an effective dose. The strong data shows you need a minimum of 500 milligrams of the fat-based equivalent CBD daily to engage the endocannabinoid system because of that dietary intake levels, right? And so most people are chronically underdosing when they're taking it, and they're probably getting placebo. I also think that which is great, right? Placebo is great until you actually feel what it's like to engage the system, and it's a game changer. But I think that the trace amounts of THC in these lower dosage thresholds, which don't match up to the data for optimization and properly turning on the system, because the metabolite delta 11 is somewhat bioactive, unlike CBD's metabolites, which really don't work at lower thresholds. I think there's some of the benefits that people are reporting, maybe beyond placebo, related to the trace amounts of THC, but that needs to be further explored. So going back, optimizing people's endocannabinoid system perpetuates their ability to feel better, which makes better decisions, which also it's been shown to increase neurogenesis in prefrontal cortex. And also we're studying cannabinoids for flow with Stephen Kotler, who's my friend and advisor to the company. We're doing the first cannabis and flow studies ever.
Yeah, it's so funny because I was interviewing Connor Murphy,
Connor's
the flow
amazing.
scientist, and he recommended Ojai Energetics CBD oil. So I was looking into it, testing it now for 2 months, and then contacting you about the interview.
Oh, it's awesome.
So yeah, it's how all connects.
It's small. It's it's getting people's endocannabinoid systems online, I think is from an internal, starting with the zone 1. If we can take care of our inner ecology and we're feeling better and our operating system is more effective, then there's going to be a higher propensity for us to collaborate and look at symbiotic relationships as opposed to being in more of a amygdala, it's an oversimplification, but more reptilian brain, right? If we can get out of that and stay in these higher functions longer, there's a higher chance that we're going to be able to collaborate better. So that's one way. And then we also figured out how to make scalable supercapacitor batteries out of our hemp waste. We're actually, supercapacitors, so energy storage systems that will outperform most likely graphene. The prelim at Bench showed that it could outperform graphene, which the reason why we haven't used graphene supercapacitors, which would solve the grid issue with microgridding as well as energy storage, and then you can use it would enable electric jets, which we have in our IP, and cars, and completely transform the way we live on the planet. It's because graphene from fly ash, which is a petroleum waste, is about $800 an ounce. And so it's just been way costly. It's not scalable, and that's why it hasn't taken off. And so we figured out a method that can actually scale graphene production out beyond benchtop from the hemp plant. These early researchers figured it out, but they couldn't scale it. And so then I partnered with a PhD from Stanford in material battery engineering and molecular engineering, and we figured it out. And we're now in CRADA with Lawrence Livermore Berkeley Labs, the national labs. I think it's the second highest concentration of Nobel laureates, and they believe that we'll get in about 8 months from launch a scalable graphene powder. So that's really exciting. So that's one of the other ways, of actually bringing this into this vision into reality and how we're doing it. And we can make plastics and concrete replacements. It's pretty profound. And so
you do a lot more than just CBD products.
We are a tech
CBD
company.
Oil.
You
really do a lot of different things under Ojai Energetics.
Yeah, that's the parent co, and that's the IP holding co, and then we're going to we call it the mothership, and then we have our sub ships.
Wow. So energetics is also really turning into
storage.
Electricity.
Correct.
Cool.
And energy in the body, right? I mean, and also Ojai is there's just an energy about Ojai, which is
it's the city you are in, right?
Yes, where I founded it, and you had philosophers, Naomi Bassan, Aldous Huxley, Krishnamurti. They would all hang out and philosophize and envision possibility of timelines for society's expansion. But that's how I see our reality coming into and we're a benefit corporation. Our ultimate mission is abundance for all life, and attaining that through practical means. And so I like my dream, and what we're going to do is at the right moment, we will open source these supercapacitors where you can 3D print them from the cloud for free from the hemp that's growing everywhere, because it grows everywhere. And life will be much, much better. I
Cool.
feel.
It's so interesting that you work together with Stephen Kotler, because I asked him about his life purpose too in my 2050 podcast, and he said that he's also really interested in keeping up the biodiversity. So I think you guys are very aligned with that.
We are. We're strangely alike. It's like we were like brothers separated at birth somehow. Like a lot of synchronicities.
Yeah,
it's a lot of fun.
So I saw you had the talk at the Cannabis Forum where you go also more in depth about the techniques and the production, what you should look into, if you're looking for an interesting supplier. One of the things that was really mind-blowing was where you talk about the cannabis plant and how deep the roots go into the earth. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that, and then after that, let's talk about your CBD oil and what makes it so special.
Awesome. So the cannabis plant's just a bizarre plant, right? It's got these properties that are very unique from a materials perspective to a nutrient and medicinal perspective, which is why it's been the most popular. It's like one of the first plants humans cultivated. And it's been there through every technological iteration and evolution on the planet, as well as providing the mechanisms to support the oxidative impact from these evolutionary jumps. The cannabinoids provided our body to be able to buffer out the oxidative stress associated. And another thing that's fascinating is it's incredibly, it's a wonder plant when it comes to systems design from an agricultural perspective. It's what's called a dynamic accumulator. So what that means is that it puts down these incredibly deep root systems, and they look like taproots, but they're technically not a taproot. It's a bundle, but they will mine nutrients, and it's incredibly effective for compacted soils, which we have done through our monoculture big ag process. And so it can actually come through and revitalize soils. Jefferson and George Washington actually wrote about how they were amazed that you could do 7-year plantings and not burn the soil versus tobacco, which would waste the soil pretty quickly. So it accumulates these micronutrients and it mines them deep down, can decompact soil, which will actually increase the ability for it to sequester CO2. In fact, effective topsoil rebuilding on the planet can sequester 30% of our carbon dioxide, which is substantial. And so it's also incredibly effective at cleaning toxic soils. And so it's been used for radiation remediation in Chernobyl. Also, it's incredibly effective at cleaning up heavy metal soil, which is also why it's really important. You do not want to eat that, right? And you don't want to use the hemp grown in toxic soils for consumption. And so that's where like our third-party testing is, and we've set the standard of always posting the results per batch, only going from organic, certified organic soils and plants. And the ability for it to impact beneficial symbiosis on an ecosystem is amazing. They're great, and they provide late bloom pollination and pollen if in the seed fields when they're grown, not for just the flowers, because you want to cull the males when it's specifically grown for the flower production. But it gives bees, it's incredible for supporting bee systems. They love it, and it can go late into the season. So it's really important on that element as well, by supporting the bee populations. It's cool.
So what's so special about the full spectrum hemp elixir from Ojai Energetics versus, all the other CBD oils out there?
So ours, we figured out how to encapsulate the oil in bubbles of water so that it can go completely. If you put it into a glass of water, it's going to go completely to the bottom. You stir it, it will be perfectly homogenized. It will never separate. You can even put it in lemon juice. But that's iced, which if anyone who's a food scientist will be like, oh, that's crazy. It's just a very stable encapsulation that we figured out. And we figured out how to do it without anything synthetic or synthetically modified. We use only certified organic plants and pressure. We just got the patent issued for all fluidic encapsulation. So it goes beyond the clean methods. But we focus on doing it safely. And so we basically encapsulate it the same way that the body encapsulates a regular CBD when you eat it as a fat in the gut. It's just that system is very inefficient. And like I talked about earlier, how our dietary intake was predominantly through indirect consumption, but substantial concentrations with a fat-based formulation. Like most products, like even if it's like 3,000 milligrams, it's typically isolate, which is nowhere near as effective as a full spectrum, which means it's CBD plus all other. There's 418 compounds. Like the trumpet section by itself is the isolate, but the trumpet section with the symphony orchestra, that's what we really need to nourish our endocannabinoid system. But the sheer quantity needed to get optimal dosages is a lot with an oil base. So with this, because of the bioavailability enhancements, because it's encapsulated in water, it gets into the bloodstream immediately, and you can take our more data now is showing it's closer to 100x bioavailability, and you can have more than 100 with PK profiles, because first it's getting it in, and then the second step, right, is how well is it absorbed in the body and used in the body. And so you can get a functional dose with less than with a dropper, where the user, we get all these people who come in, they're like, I never tried, and CBD never worked. It's like, it makes sense, because he didn't take anywhere near 500 milligrams of fat-based equivalent. And so with this, less than a dropper can get that. And it also kicks in about 30 seconds as opposed to 30 minutes, right? And so it's very useful for a lot of situations. You want to feel it and have it work with rapid onset. So that's a big difference.
What would be the suggested serving size? How do you take it? Because I also ask you about that.
Perfect.
The really crazy thing is you put it under your tongue, right? And in the beginning it's sour, then it gets sweet. But if you take too much, it gets sour again. So can you explain how does that work? And then how do you figure out the perfect dosage?
So it's a phenomena that we actually discovered. And there's other, there's comparable phenomena of flavor modulation only with water-soluble compounds, because it has to be able to get in right away. But zinc, for example, when you take zinc and you don't have enough, it's going to taste like water. And then when you get enough, it tastes this fuzzy metallic. And so there's an indication of a feedback with our taste receptors in the tongue that happens with zinc. And with cannabinoids, there's actually multiple bell curves of efficaciousness. So if that's efficacy and that's dosage, it's not linear. More does not mean more effective. There's actually curves of efficaciousness. So more can be less effective than slightly less, right? And the issue is that these bell curves are not static. They're actually modulating on a daily basis, tending to trend downward. So meaning you need less over time, not more. With CBD, unlike THC, you build tolerance. CBD, you tend to have an inverse tolerance. However, oxidative events cause it to go up. So it's a moving target.
So when you're stressed, you need more?
Yes. Or you go on a plane, right? Like basically because the endocannabinoid system is buffering oxidative stress, that's one of the mechanisms that maintains homeostasis. And each bell curve peak just means more systems that the body can deploy the cannabinoids to take care of and make sure that they're operating at optimal levels. And so it operates in what's called like triage. Right, so it has a list of which systems are most out of balance, and sometimes the systems that we think are most out of balance, the body's like, actually, you're not there. Typically, though, we're pretty close when we're cognition of something. It tends to be if the first sweet spot, if you titrate the dose and it goes fully sweet like honey, and within about a minute, or you don't feel the needle move on what you thought was number one, if you redose, it will go back down the bell curve and get more and more bitter. And then sour, and then back up to sweet like honey again. The second sweet spot, typically what we think is number one, will make the cut on that triage list. So you can actually pinpoint a perfect dose for your body every single time utilizing that dosage method, which is unique to our tech because it gets in so quickly and it's so bioavailable.
It's really crazy when you think about that. It's basically a smart CBD oil, and it knows how much you need to take.
It's pretty
That's
cool.
mind-blowing.
It is mind-blowing. One of our doctors we work with sent, because we didn't know exactly how it worked. We've seen it through data aggregation. Like it's clearly there's bell curve, and the bell curve distribution has been well documented, like most compounds. But we were like, oh, it's got to be a CB2 agonization or modulation, which are the cannabinoid receptors of the tongue. And then one of the practitioners sent us a study demonstrating that the endocannabinoid system is responsible for the regulation of sweet in the tongue. And so that's the mechanism of how it's acting. It's pretty cool, and it's really important when you don't want to miss an effective dose, right? Because with a fat-based formulation, or even another there's other techniques for solubilization, like a liposomal, which is actually covered in our IP, but we don't use because it's less effective. It's only around an 8x bioavailability. You can't do it with just certified organic compounds. You have to use synthetically modified lecithin. At best, at worst, people are using polyethylene glycol, which is basically a multi-chain antifreeze compound made up of petroleum. It's disgusting for regular consumption, particularly at nanoscale. But that has about a 15 to 20 minute onset. And so by the time it diffuses out, the feedback loop is gone. And so you're shooting in the dark with other formulations. You could be in a valley, you could be at a peak. And so for situations where you really don't want to miss a dose, this way you can always pinpoint, and it's incredibly effective. Yeah, it's a lot of fun. It's a cool discovery.
After the second peak in the second bell curve, is there a third one?
There are. You can keep going, which is another kind of discovery. There's multiple bell curves, and you can just keep riding it. It's going to keep modulating. At a certain point, the body, if you get like just a saturation, you're going to pee them out. The LD50 for CBD, you would get horribly sick from water content before you got any issue from the cannabinoids.
Did you ever try like one whole bottle of this?
Yes.
And what happened?
So you feel it's quite it's amazing. It basically so CBD works on our body's endocannabinoid system, produces, we know of, there's guaranteed more, but we know there's two compounds, one called anandamide, one called 2-AG. And anandamide is named after Ananda, the Sanskrit word for bliss. And these were named by the godfather of the endocannabinoid system, Dr. Raphael Mukulayan, who like tested isolate and full spectrum. He's like, isolate is nowhere near as effective, right? And he dubbed it the entourage effect. So what CBD does, one of the mechanisms is that it lowers this compound called FAAH, which destroys our body's anandamide content. And every time we have a stress event, FAAH rises, right? And so CBD is like a governor to that. Now, anandamide is named after the Sanskrit word for bliss, and it's essentially our endogenous equivalent of THC. And so the runner's high used to be considered just endorphins. It's actually been shown to be high levels of peaks of anandamide, and you feel really good. And it's because it's agonizing CB1. So when you take a ton of CBD, you get an incredibly high amount of anandamide in the body. And so you feel altered, but not anywhere, no psychedelic, nothing. Just like, it's definitely like a runner's high, like just a super potent, blissy focus, but you're totally you. It's not psychoactive in that sense.
Can you sleep well after it if you take such a high dose? Or
well, another thing that's interesting is that CBD is very much it's like an adaptogen in the sense that it's a modulator. The endocannabinoid system modulates other systems. It's not single directional typically, and whereas THC is like a scalpel. It kind of just pushes you in one direction. So it can regulate or down-regulate adenosine response, which is associated with energy, right? And caffeine targets adenosine response. So CBD in the morning can give you an energy boost, whereas CBD in the evening will help you sleep better. Even actually, people find that taking it in the morning, a lot of people report sleeping better because it's actually it's recalibrating the circadian rhythm in the endocrine system. It regulates the endocrine system. But it modulates depending on what the body it needs it to do. So sometimes, like let's say you're burning the wick at both ends, and your body, but you gotta crank through something, and your body, you take it, and it's like, nope, we want you to slow down and rest, and you can't do that, right? So it turns out these compounds called terpenes, which are like what smell and things, but they do a lot more than just smell. Actually are like tugboats or biorudders to the cannabinoids. So they essentially will guide the cannabinoids as payload and take them to particular receptor sites and regions that the terpenes are going to. And the only way that they're really effective, they're even less bioavailable than cannabinoids. And cannabinoids have very poor solubility, and unless you encapsulate, which we do, they're even worse. And so the only really effective way for them to get into the bloodstream, into the body, and be utilized is via inhalation. So they go up through olfactory, cross into hypothalamus, and then they deploy. And so that's where it's more pronounced before, and was discovered on THC for people who were vaporizing or smoking. They'd find that an indica strain would make them, typically indica, would make them very sedative, right, and couch locked, versus a cerebral effect from sativa, which has high pinene and limonene, right? So if you look at the minor cannabinoids and the major cannabinoids, they're basically identical, but the strains have completely different effects in the user. And that's because of the terpenes. And so you can, unique to our tech, because ours gets in immediately, you can take it till it's sweet and then smell a peppermint essential oil, and it will, timing syncs up, and you can custom curate mood essentially on demand and payload delivery.
Can you repeat this?
Yes.
I want to write this down.
Yeah.
Like, so I take some CBD oil and then
take it till it's sweet, and then
oil.
smell peppermint essential oil or peppermint plant, mint plant, and the menthol terpene is going to direct the cannabinoids to focus more on adenosine receptors, and it's going to hit with alertness. So you can basically utilize these terpenes to take triage list function and bump them to the top of the list. So you're not going to pull yourself out of balance, but you can reprioritize, right? Which is crazy.
Cool. I got a mint plant out there, so maybe.
Okay, so it's really, and it's quite visceral, which is fascinating. So you can then go and smell a lavender plant, and the linalool is going to direct the cannabinoids to target it will feel very calming. It's not going to be sedative, but calming. Citrus has the limonene in it, and the limonene, which tends to be more sativas, right? It directs the cannabinoids to focus more on dopamine system as well as digestive system. So if you smell a citrus and take the CBD, it's going to feel more blissy and dopamine centric.
So what's the timing?
So basically take it till it's sweet like honey, and then deep inhalation of the terpenes. You're pulling them up into blood-brain, because ours gets in it immediately. They sync up, and now you've got a custom strain or mood on demand. And you do it side by side. If you want to like play with it, you can do peppermint and then smell like a thyme or a lemongrass that has myrcene in it, and myrcene is sedative. And so you can go like on off, and it's quite fun.
Cool.
Yeah.
Sounds like some very good ideas for some new biohacking videos for me.
It's good. And we've got the IP for VR/AR with cannabinoids and custom mood modulation, so we can actually sequence timing of a customized payload for that individual and target particular receptors in the body or target moods. So you go into a landscape and you want to be hit with relaxation. So we can. It's going to be a lot.
I think that's also, again, what Stephen Kotler is really interested in. Introducing flow states through VR. Right?
For sure. So flow with flow triggers with VR with the cannabinoids is our thesis of going to be an effective or hypothesis.
Cool. Can you go a bit into that, like how
it could work?
CBD for flow?
Yeah. So we're going to be doing the prelim studies. The mounting kind of systems and different evidence and data points. So we know for sure that one of the neurochemicals in flow is anandamide, right? And that we know that helps with lateral thinking, so complex nodal connections, right? But we're starting to see that, so CBD also increases nitric oxide production of the body. The athletes that we work with all report and imagine you may have found that it's easier to get into flow when you're after taking the CBD. And so we're going to test like ease to get in as well as extension and quality of states. But we're going to be testing out on what the endocannabinoid system's role really is in flow altogether, as well as, so it's quite, and the pieces are stacking really, really beautifully.
Oh, wow. That sounds super interesting. So I think we should do another interview in a year and
get some
updates on the studies.
It's going to be fun.
Interesting. Maybe to close this interview, what are your personal biohacking or flow habits? What are you doing?
So, wake up, drink water, take the CBD, and then I'll put myself into kind of like a period of where I want stressors to hit, right, and to build that stress response, which increases like the norepinephrine, potentially cortisol. So like work through stuff that are causing frustration. And frustration is key, right, for flow. We need that
in the flow cycle.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then go out and do some kettlebells. And that will typically kick in the flow, and then I just jam. Sometimes if I want, like I need to hack it quickly, right? And it does work. It's not anywhere near as effective as like a kind of flow cycle trigger from actual potential stress, like and skill set, right? Challenges. But a hack is like exercise-induced transient hypofrontality, right? So 20-minute low-grade exercise, shot of espresso, kick that norepinephrine, and then I take the CBD, and biochemically, I've kind of hacked flow. It's nowhere near as good, but you can do that with and layering in like real challenge elements, and my days just are awesome. Yeah. And then recovery, definitely like steaming. And then the cool thing is like you can use the CBD then for the recovery stage, like all the cycle stages. The cannabinoid complex helps because of its homeostatic balancing element, enhance each stage of flow.
So if you think again about your 2050 goal, the symbiotic species, Ojai Energetics, how can people support you? How can they find you if they're interested now to check you out or help you in your mission? Yeah,
well, I really believe like we're all, like everyone's genius is inherent. So like just by following that internally, like that we're all in it together, right? We're really one unit. All ships rise. And then we're found online. We're going to be expanding distribution in Europe, and follow your passions. That tends to lead to why we're here and our innate genius. And you can check us out at ojaiaenergetics.com. And if you have questions, you can always email us. And how did you what's your experience been with the CBD?
Max here. You can check out my 30-day review on the Ojai Energetics full spectrum hemp elixir, the water-soluble CBD oil on my YouTube. And don't forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons here on YouTube. Thank you for watching.